The rag paused its circular journey across the dark, scarred wood of the bar. It stopped directly in front of my hand, which was wrapped loosely around the condensation of a second whiskey. Julian's knuckles were white where he gripped the cloth, his gaze fixed on my glass, not on my face. The low thrum of the bar, the quiet chatter of the other regulars, the mournful sigh of a saxophone from the ancient speakers seemed to fade into a distant hum. All I could hear was the frantic, stupid thumping in my own chest. He finally lifted his eyes. They were the color of moss after a rainstorm, deep and unreadable, and they held mine for a beat too long. A flicker of something I couldn't name, something I'd been chasing in my mind for 6 months, danced in their depths. "Another," he said, his voice a low gravel that always seemed to vibrate right through the wood, up my elbows, and settle somewhere deep in my gut. He gestured with his chin at my nearly empty glass. Or, he let the word hang in the air, a perfect, shimmering sphere of possibility. His gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth and then back again. Us. My breath hitched. My entire world, a carefully constructed fortress of quiet observation and lonely routine, tilted on its axis. Us, it was a word I had only ever dared to imagine in the privacy of my own head. Usually on the long walk home from this very bar, the ghost of his scent, something like limes and clean laundry, still clinging to the air around my usual seat at the corner of the bar. For a man who spoke in economical sentences and communicated mostly through raised eyebrows and knowing smirks, it was a bombshell, a direct hit. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by 2 simple syllables. All the witty retorts, the casual deflections I'd practiced in the mirror, evaporated. I was just Leo, the quiet guy in the corner who read paperbacks and nursed his drinks for an hour at a time. The guy who had been watching him, cataloging him, for half a year. I watched the way his forearms flexed when he shook a cocktail, the small lines that crinkled around his eyes when he laughed at a customer's bad joke, the way he'd absent-mindedly chew on the inside of his cheek when he was calculating a tab. I had collected these details like precious stones, turning them over and over in my mind, polishing them with my pathetic, unspoken yearning. And now he knew, or he was guessing, or he was just a world-class flirt who tried this line on anyone who looked lonely enough. The last possibility sent a cold spike of humiliation through my gut. Us. I finally managed, and my voice was a reedy, unfamiliar thing. He leaned forward, propping his elbows on the bar. The space between us shrank. I could smell it now, that clean scent, mixed with the faint, sharp tang of the lemon he'd just been cutting. His smile was slow, a deliberate unfolding. It wasn't the broad, easy grin he gave the tourists. This one was smaller, quieter, and aimed directly at me. "Yeah, us," he repeated, his voice even lower now, a conspiratorial murmur. "Figured we've spent enough time on opposite sides of this bar. Thought maybe it was time for a change of scenery." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner. I stared at him, at the genuine curiosity in his eyes, and the fortress I'd built around myself began to crumble, brick by silent brick. I had come here tonight for the same reason I came here every Tuesday and Friday, to feel a little less alone by being around people without having to actually interact with them. To watch him. It was a sad, simple ritual, and he had just calmly, quietly, set a match to it. I looked down at my glass, at the single melting ice cube. I could say no. I could laugh it off, order another drink, and retreat back into the comfortable safety of my anonymity. I could preserve the fantasy, the one where he was a perfect, unattainable figure and I was his silent, devoted observer. But when I looked back up at him, at the patient hope in his gaze, I knew I couldn't. I was so tired of being safe. "Okay," I breathed, the word barely a whisper. "Us." Julian's smile widened, reaching his eyes this time. The crinkles appeared, just as I'd memorized. "Good," he said, straightening up and tossing the rag into a bin behind the bar. "My shift ends in 30. Don't go anywhere." He turned to serve another customer, moving with that fluid, unhurried grace I knew so well. And I sat there, my heart a chaotic drum solo in the sudden silence of my world, a single word echoing in my mind. Us. The next 30 minutes were the longest of my life. I didn't touch my drink. I just sat there, my hands clasped in my lap to keep them from trembling, and pretended to be fascinated by the wood grain of the bar. Every time Julian moved past my corner, my senses went on high alert. I was acutely aware of the whisper of his denim-clad legs, the faint clink of the bottle opener clipped to his belt, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him. He was a planet, and I was a stupid, helpless moon caught in his orbit. My internal monologue was a frantic, looping catastrophe. What did us mean? A walk? A talk? Him taking me to his apartment, which I assumed was somewhere nearby, and murdering me? My brain, ever helpful, supplied a montage of true crime documentary scenarios. He was a quiet man, the neighbors would say, kept to himself. We never expected he'd be lured to his death by a handsome, flirtatious bartender. I took a shaky breath and tried to rein in the absurdity. He wasn't a killer. He was just a man who had seen something in me. Loneliness, desire, desperation, maybe all three, and decided to call it out. I risked a glance at him. He was talking to a couple at the other end of the bar, laughing. The sound was low and rich, and it made my stomach do a slow, pathetic flip. He caught my eye over the woman's shoulder and gave me a subtle wink. A wink. My face flushed with heat, and I immediately looked back down at the bar, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my sternum. This was real. This was happening. He had a way of observing that I'd always found unnerving and magnetic in equal measure. While I was the master of covert watching, hiding behind a book or the dim lighting, Julian's observation was direct, unapologetic. Sometimes, in the middle of polishing a glass or taking an order, his eyes would just land on me, and he'd hold my gaze for a few seconds. No smile, no expression, just a quiet, intense assessment. It always felt like he was looking right through my carefully constructed facade, seeing the anxious, hopeful mess underneath. I used to think I was imagining it, projecting my own feelings onto him. But tonight, with that wink, that simple, conspiratorial gesture, I knew I hadn't been. He had been watching me watch him. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Finally, a woman with short, spiky blonde hair came out from the back, tying on an apron. Julian said a few words to her, clapped her on the shoulder, and then began wiping down his section of the bar with a final, efficient sweep. He moved with a purpose that made my own indecisiveness feel even more pronounced. He untied his apron, hung it on a hook, and then grabbed a worn leather jacket from behind the counter. He didn't look at me again until he was walking around the edge of the bar, heading for the door. He just paused by my stool, his presence a sudden, solid wall of warmth next to me. "Ready?" he asked, his voice back to that low, intimate murmur. I nodded, my throat too dry for words. I slid off the stool, my legs feeling unsteady. I fumbled for my wallet, but he put a hand on my arm, stopping me. His touch was firm, his fingers warm through the thin fabric of my shirt. It was the first time he'd ever touched me for more than the fleeting brush of our hands exchanging a glass. The contact sent a jolt straight up my arm. "It's on me," he said. His eyes flicked down to where his hand rested on my arm, then back to my face. He didn't move his hand. All of it. Was he talking about the drinks? Or the last 6 months of my silent patronage? My brain was too fuzzy to decipher the subtext. I just nodded again, feeling like a bobblehead. He finally let go, and the spot on my arm felt strangely cold without his touch. He led the way to the door, and I followed, feeling like a ghost being led out of his own haunting. The cool night air was a shock after the warm, close atmosphere of the bar. The street was quiet, washed in the orange glow of the streetlights. I shoved my hands in my pockets, unsure of what to do with them, what to do with any part of myself. Julian stood on the sidewalk, shrugging on his jacket. He seemed completely at ease, as if asking a silent, brooding customer out on a whim was a regular part of his Tuesday night. "So," he said, turning to me, a small smile playing on his lips. "Leo, you want to get out of here?" He knew my name. Of course, he knew my name. I'd used my credit card enough times. But hearing him say it, the single syllable rolling off his tongue so easily, felt different. It made me feel seen. Solid. Real. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice still a little shaky. He grinned, a flash of white in the dim light. "My place. It's just upstairs. I want to show you something." My mind immediately went to the gutter, and my face must have shown it, because he let out a soft chuckle. "Relax," he said, his tone teasing. "It's not my etchings. It's my rooftop. The view is better from up there." He gestured to a narrow, unassuming door next to the bar's entrance. Come on. He unlocked the door and held it open for me. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my internal alarm bells ringing faintly. But then I looked at his face, at the open, patient expression in his eyes, and I stepped across the threshold. I was tired of listening to alarms. I wanted to hear the music. The stairwell was narrow and smelled of dust and old paint. Our footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs. I followed him up 3 flights, my eyes fixed on the back of his leather jacket, the way it moved with the flex of his shoulders. He was a solid presence in front of me, a steady guide into the unknown. When we reached the top landing, he unlocked another door and pushed it open, revealing not an apartment, but another, steeper set of metal stairs. Almost there, he said over his shoulder. The air grew colder as we ascended. He pushed open a heavy metal hatch at the top, and we emerged onto a flat, gravel-covered roof. The city spread out before us, a glittering tapestry of lights under a dark, starless sky. The distant sound of traffic was a low, constant hum. It was beautiful. Wow, I breathed. Right, Julian said, coming to stand beside me at the low brick parapet. This is why I bought this building. For this. We stood in silence for a few moments, just looking out at the city. The awkwardness of the bar seemed to dissipate up here, blown away by the cool night breeze. It felt easier, more real. I've seen you, you know, he said, his voice quiet, not looking at me. Even when you think I haven't. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? I see you watching me, he said simply. He turned his head, his profile sharp against the city lights. You're not as subtle as you think you are, Leo. A hot flush of shame crept up my neck. I was exposed. All my secret observations, my pathetic pining, laid bare on a rooftop. I wanted the gravel to swallow me whole. I started, but I had no defense. He turned to face me fully, his expression softening. Hey, it's okay. He took a step closer, and my breath caught. I like it. You do? Yeah, he said, his voice a low thrum. I do. Because I've been watching you too. That simple admission changed everything. It reframed the past 6 months. It wasn't just me, the lonely observer, and him, the oblivious object of my affection. It was a silent, two-way street. We were both watching, both waiting. He reached out and gently tucked a stray piece of my hair behind my ear. His fingers were cool from the night air, and they brushed against my skin, sending a shower of sparks down my spine. It was such a small, intimate gesture. So much more than a hand on an arm. It was a deliberate, tender touch that spoke volumes. You have this look on your face sometimes, he murmured, his fingers lingering by my temple. When you're reading, like you're a million miles away. I always wondered where you went. I couldn't speak. I was drowning in his moss-green eyes, in the shocking reality of his touch. He was real. He was here, and he had been wondering about me. And then sometimes, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. You look at me, and you're not a million miles away at all. You're right there. And your eyes, they say a lot. His thumb brushed softly against my skin. My entire body felt like a live wire. This is it. This is the moment where I either run back down those stairs and never show my face in that bar again, or I lean into the terrifying, wonderful possibility in front of me. I choose. Right now, I am choosing. I leaned in, just an inch, but it was enough. His eyes darkened, and his gaze dropped to my lips. The world narrowed to the few inches of cold air between us. I could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the slight parting of his lips. It was a question, a silent invitation. And for the first time in a very long time, I knew the answer. The weeks that followed were a strange, delicate dance. Nothing was defined. We hadn't kissed on the rooftop that first night. The moment had hung there, thick with potential, until Julian had pulled his hand back with a soft, almost regretful smile. It's getting cold, he'd said. I should let you get home. And he had walked me down, all the way to the street, waiting until I'd turned the corner before going back inside. The anticlimax should have been disappointing, but instead, it felt respectful. He wasn't rushing. He was letting me set the pace, even if my pace was glacial. My visits to the bar changed. I still sat in my corner, but the space between us felt different. It was charged, humming with a low-grade electricity. Our interactions were a tapestry woven from small, significant threads. He'd bring me my drink without me having to order, always remembering if I'd had a rough day and needed something stronger. He'd lean against the bar in front of me during lulls, his hip occasionally brushing my knee, and talk about nothing: the weather, a new beer on tap, a funny story about a customer. But the words were just a cover for the real conversation happening in the space between them, in the lingering eye contact and the shared, knowing smiles. I became an expert in Julianology. I learned that the tiny muscle that jumped in his jaw meant he was annoyed. I learned that he ran a hand through his dark hair when he was tired. I learned that when he was genuinely amused, his smile was slightly crooked, lifting higher on the left side. These were my new precious stones, more valuable than the ones I had collected before, because now they were tinged with the possibility of reciprocation. My internal analysis went into overdrive. Every action was a clue to be deciphered. One night, he was wiping down the counter and his hand brushed mine. It was a simple, accidental touch, but his fingers lingered for a second too long. My skin buzzed from the contact for the rest of the night. I replayed it in my head 1,000 times. Was it an accident? Did he mean for it to linger? Was he testing my reaction? My mind was a corkboard covered in red string, connecting every glance, every word, every fleeting touch, trying to form a coherent picture. The meaningful touches became more frequent, less ambiguous. A hand on the small of my back as he squeezed past me in the crowded bar, his fingers closing over mine for a moment when I paid my tab in cash. One evening, I was reading, and he came over, leaning in close to read the title of my book. His arm was pressed against my shoulder, and his head was so close to mine I could feel the warmth from his skin, smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. "Good book?" he'd murmured, his breath ghosting against my ear. I had completely forgotten how to read. I'd forgotten the entire English language. I could only manage a strangled noise of affirmation. He'd chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated through my entire body, and squeezed my shoulder before moving away. I didn't read another word that night. I just sat there, the imprint of his touch burning through my shirt, my mind replaying that single moment of proximity on a continuous, heart-stopping loop. I was living in a state of sustained, exquisite tension. Every interaction was a step closer to a precipice I couldn't see. I was both terrified of falling and desperate to jump. I felt more alive than I had in years, every nerve ending humming with a nervous, hopeful energy. My quiet, gray life had been saturated with color, and the artist was a bartender with moss-green eyes and a smile that could undo me. The breakthrough came on a rainy Friday night. The bar was packed, noisy and steamy from the press of wet bodies. I had managed to snag my usual corner stool, but the atmosphere was chaotic. Julian was a whirlwind of motion, a blur of flying shakers and poured drafts. I watched him, mesmerized by his efficiency, his easy way with the loud, demanding crowd. He never looked stressed. He just moved, a steady, capable center in the swirling chaos. Near the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, a piece of equipment behind the bar, some kind of refrigeration unit, started making a horrific grinding noise, followed by a sudden, ominous silence. Julian cursed under his breath, a sharp, frustrated sound. He spent a few minutes crouched down, fiddling with it, but it was clearly dead. "Damn it," he muttered, standing up and wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked over at me, his brow furrowed in genuine annoyance. "That's the main cooler for the bottled beer. Everything in there will be warm by tomorrow. Is there a backup?" I asked, surprised at myself for speaking up. He shook his head. "It's in the basement. It's ancient, heavy as a damn car, and the dolly's broken. There's no way I can get it up here myself," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was the tired gesture. My heart gave a little pang of sympathy. And then, an idea, both insane and brilliant, popped into my head. "I could help," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "After you close." Julian stopped, turning to look at me properly. The exhaustion on his face was replaced by surprise, and then something else. A slow smile spread across his lips. The crooked one. "You do that, Leo?" he asked, his voice soft. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual, as if offering to haul commercial refrigeration units for my secret crush was a perfectly normal thing for me to do. "I'm stronger than I look." It was a blatant lie. I had the upper body strength of a wet noodle. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "Okay," he said, "I'll take you up on that. Don't say I didn't warn you, though. It's a beast." So I waited. I nursed a glass of water, Watching him close up the bar, my stomach a knot of nervous anticipation. This was it. A shared experience. A task. A reason to be in his space after hours, with the doors locked and the rest of the world shut out. It felt like a monumental step, a crossing of a new threshold. When the last customer had stumbled out into the rain, he locked the door and flipped the sign to closed. He turned to me, and in the dim, quiet bar, he looked different. Younger. More vulnerable. The bartender persona was gone. It was just Julian. Ready to wrestle a monster in a damp basement? He asked, his smile a little tired but genuine. Born ready. I lied again, with a confidence I didn't feel. The basement was exactly as advertised. Damp, smelling of earth and mildew, and dimly lit by a single, bare bulb. And in the corner, lurking like a metal troll, was the backup cooler. It was an old, heavy-duty monstrosity from another era. It looked like it had been built to survive a nuclear apocalypse. Right? Julian said, clapping his hands together. The beast. What followed was an hour of grunting, sweating, and strategic swearing. The cooler was impossibly heavy and awkward. We had to navigate it around pipes, up a narrow set of concrete stairs, and through the tight space behind the bar. It was a clumsy, intimate ballet of strained muscles and close proximity. My arm brushed his. Our shoulders knocked together. At one point, on the stairs, I lost my footing, and he grabbed me, his hands firm on my waist to steady me, his body pressed against my back. You okay? He asked, his voice a low rumble right by my ear. I was far from okay. My heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I could feel the solid warmth of his chest against my shoulder blades, his breath on my neck. I was acutely aware of every point of contact. I just managed to nod, my throat tight. He held on for a second longer than necessary before letting go. We finally wrestled the cooler into place. We were both panting, covered in a thin sheen of sweat and a fair amount of dust. I leaned against the bar, trying to catch my breath, my muscles screaming in protest. Julian disappeared into the back and returned with 2 bottles of beer, beads of condensation already forming on the cold glass. He handed one to me. Our fingers brushed. This time, it felt different. We weren't bartender and customer. We were partners in a ridiculous, strenuous task. We had accomplished something together. To the beast, he said, clinking his bottle against mine. Thank you, Leo. Seriously, I couldn't have done that alone. Anytime, I said, and I meant it. I would have helped him move a mountain. He took a long pull from his beer, his throat working. Then he looked at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The easy camaraderie of our shared task began to fade, replaced by that familiar, charged tension. You know, he said, his voice quiet. You never told me where you go. Go? I asked, confused. When you're reading, he clarified, his eyes fixed on mine. That look on your face. You're a million miles away. Where is it you go? It was such a surprisingly personal question. No one had ever asked me that. No one had ever noticed enough to ask. People saw me with a book and just assumed I didn't want to be disturbed. They didn't wonder about the world inside my head. But Julian did. I looked away, suddenly feeling shy and exposed. Nowhere special, I mumbled. Just in the story, I guess. I don't believe that, he said softly. He took a step closer. The air grew thick. I think you go somewhere you feel safe. His perception was a punch to the gut. He was right. Books were my fortress, the walls I built to keep the world out, to keep my own loneliness at bay. Inside a story, I could be anyone, anywhere. I could be brave. I could be loved. I didn't know how to respond. The truth was lodged in my throat, a painful, vulnerable lump. He saw my struggle, and his expression softened. In that moment, he wasn't the confident, flirty bartender. He was just a man, seeing another man's pain and offering a moment of quiet understanding. It was a glimpse of a different Julian, a softer, more introspective one. He didn't press me. He just stood there, in the quiet of his closed bar, and shared the silence with me. He let me be vulnerable without demanding a confession. And in that quiet, shared moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the night's conversations and the smell of spilled beer and lemon, I felt a barrier inside me crack. He wasn't just a crush anymore. He was someone who saw me, truly saw me. And I knew, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, that I was in very, very deep. We stood there in the charged silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds were the hum of the newly installed cooler and the faint drip of a leaky tap. The comfortable exhaustion from our shared labor had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, humming tension that was more potent than anything I'd ever felt across the polished surface of the bar. The roles we usually played had been stripped away. He wasn't the bartender. I wasn't the customer. We were just two men in a dimly lit room, breathing the same air, caught in the same invisible current. Julian took another slow sip of his beer, his eyes never leaving my face. He was watching me with that intense, assessing gaze, but now it felt different. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something that felt like a question being asked without words. He was waiting for something. For me to run, or for me to stay. My own beer was untouched in my hand. My palms were slick with a nervous sweat. My mind was a frantic race of possibilities and fears. This was the tipping point. This was the moment where the slow burn either ignited or fizzled out into a plume of awkward smoke. I knew, with a gut-deep certainty, that if I walked out that door tonight, we would go back to the way things were, and this fragile, beautiful thing we were building would shatter. He must have seen the war on my face, because he set his bottle down on the bar with a soft clink. The sound was deafening in the silence. He took a step closer, then another. He stopped when he was barely a foot away from me. I had to tilt my head back slightly to meet his gaze. Up close, I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. He was overwhelmingly, breathtakingly real. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that seemed to scrape against my nerve endings. "Are you just going to keep watching me? Or are you finally going to do something about it?" The question was a direct challenge. A gauntlet thrown. He was done with the subtle dance, the meaningful glances, the fleeting touches. He was pushing, forcing a confrontation, not out of impatience, but, I suspected, out of a need for honesty. He was tired of the subtext. He wanted text. My throat was desert dry. My heart was a wild, panicked bird beating against the cage of my ribs. All my carefully constructed defenses, my years of emotional isolation, were crumbling under the weight of his direct gaze. He was asking for something I hadn't given anyone in a very long time. A clear, unambiguous sign. He was asking me to be brave. What do you want me to do?" I whispered, the words feeling thin and inadequate. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was a sad, knowing kind of smile. "That's the thing," he said, his voice impossibly soft. "I think you know." He didn't move. He just stood there, giving me the space, giving me the choice. He was putting all the power in my hands, and it was the most terrifying and exhilarating feeling in the world. He had seen my desire, had mirrored it with his own, and had now laid it all out between us, a fragile offering. All I had to do was reach out and take it. My body moved before my brain could veto the action. My hand, the one not holding the beer bottle, came up. It trembled slightly in the air between us. I wanted to touch him. I wanted to lay my palm against his cheek, to feel the warmth of his skin, to confirm that this was real. But I hesitated, my fingers hovering inches from his face. The fear of rejection, a cold and ancient fear, held me paralyzed. He saw my hesitation. He closed his eyes for a brief second, as if gathering his own courage, and then he leaned forward, closing the final inches of space himself. He pressed his cheek into my trembling, waiting palm. The contact was electric. His skin was warm, the stubble a rough, pleasant texture against my fingertips. A shudder went through my entire body. He let out a soft breath, a sigh of what sounded like relief, and his eyes fluttered open. They were dark, stormy, full of an emotion I couldn't dare to name. My thumb, acting on its own volition, stroked softly across his cheekbone. He leaned into the touch, a silent surrender. The world fell away. There was no bar, no cooler, no city outside. There was only the feeling of his skin under my hand, the heat in his eyes, the scent of him, lime and laundry and hard work. "Julian," I breathed, his name a prayer on my lips. He didn't say anything. He just lifted his own hand and gently wrapped his fingers around my wrist, holding my hand in place against his face. His touch was so careful, so deliberate. He wasn't grabbing or pulling. He was anchoring. He was telling me to stay. This was our loaded interaction, not with words, but with this single, profound point of contact. My hand on his face. his hand on my wrist. It was a conversation more honest than any we could have had with our voices. It spoke of longing, of patience, of a quiet, mutual understanding that had been building for months. The silence stretched, but it wasn't awkward. It was full. It was the silence of two people who have finally stopped circling each other and have met in the middle. The tension hadn't broken, it had transformed. It was no longer the anxious tension of uncertainty, but the deep, humming tension of imminent connection. I felt a tear escape the corner of my eye and trace a hot path down my temple. It was a tear of overwhelming relief, of a dam of loneliness finally breaking. Julian's thumb moved on my wrist, a small, comforting circle. He saw the tear, but he didn't comment on it. He just held my gaze, his own eyes shining with a fierce, protective tenderness. He was giving me everything I had ever wanted without me having to ask. He was giving me his attention, his patience, his vulnerability. And in that moment, I knew I was completely, irrevocably lost. Or maybe, for the first time, I was found. The pressure in my chest was immense, a combination of terror and a desperate, soaring hope. It was the culmination of 6 months of silent yearning, of 1,000 tiny observations, of 100 replayed moments. It all led here, to this quiet, dimly lit bar, with my hand on his face and the world holding its breath. I knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was liberating, that I had to be the one to break the silence. I had to give him the words he was waiting for. "I come here for you," I said, my voice cracking on the last word. The confession hung in the air, raw and fragile. It was the simplest, most honest thing I had ever said. Every time. "It's always been for you." A visible wave of relief washed over Julian's features. The tension in his shoulders eased, and his grip on my wrist softened, his fingers lacing through mine. He brought my hand, still cupped to his cheek, to his lips, and pressed a soft, warm kiss into the center of my palm. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, it stole the air from my lungs. He lowered our joined hands, but he didn't let go. He kept my fingers intertwined with his, a warm, solid anchor in my sea of overwhelming emotion. He took a small step closer, so our bodies were almost touching. I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "Leo," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I know." His other hand came up, not to my face, but to the back of my neck, his fingers gently threading into my hair. The touch was possessive and gentle all at once. He tilted my head up slightly, his gaze dropping to my mouth. The air crackled. The world narrowed to this single, inevitable point. This was it, the breaking point. "I'm not pretending anymore, Leo," he whispered, his voice a rough velvet. "I'm done watching from across the bar." And then he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of relief, of a dam breaking for both of us. His lips were soft and warm, and they tasted faintly of beer and of something that was just him. It was a slow, deep kiss that spoke of patience and a long-held wanting. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was a conversation. It said, "I see you. I've been waiting. You're finally here." My eyes fluttered shut. My free hand, which was still holding the damn beer bottle, finally let go. The bottle dropped to the floor, landing with a soft thud on the rubber mat, forgotten. I brought my hand up to his chest, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. He deepened the kiss, his tongue gently tracing the seam of my lips, a silent request for entry. I parted them without hesitation, and a soft gasp escaped my throat as he explored my mouth with a confident, unhurried thoroughness. A thrill, sharp and sweet, shot through me. It was a kiss that consumed me, that rewrote every lonely night I had ever spent, that promised a future I had never dared to imagine. He pulled back slightly, just enough so our foreheads were resting against each other. We were both breathing heavily, our breath mingling in the small space between us. His eyes were closed, his long lashes dark against his skin. His hand was still tangled in my hair, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind my ear. "Right?" he breathed, the word a simple, profound statement. It felt right. It felt like coming home to a place I didn't even know I was searching for. I couldn't form words. I could only nod, my forehead rubbing against his. I opened my eyes and just looked at him. This man who had seen through my walls and had patiently, persistently waited for me to let him in. The gratitude I felt was so immense it was painful. He opened his eyes, and the green was dark and deep, like a forest pool. He smiled, that slow, crooked smile that was just for me. I was beginning to think I'd have to drop a refrigerator on you every week to get you to talk to me. A laugh, wet and shaky, bubbled up out of my chest. I'm not that dense, I managed to say, my voice hoarse. No, he said, his expression turning serious again, his thumb stroking my cheekbone. You're not dense. You're careful. And that's okay. That simple act of understanding, of accepting my fear and my caution without judgment, was almost more intimate than the kiss itself. He got it. He got me. He laced his fingers with mine, our hands a comfortable, solid weight between us. It was a new connection, a tangible symbol of the shift that had just occurred. We were no longer two separate entities observing each other from a distance. We were connected. We were US. He leaned in and gave me another kiss, this one softer, quicker, a simple sealing of the promise the first one had made. When he pulled away, he kept his forehead pressed to mine. Stay, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet, hopeful plea. Don't go home tonight. I didn't even have to think about it. I was already home. Okay, I whispered. I woke slowly, disoriented. The light filtering into the room was gray and soft, the kind that signals early morning. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The ceiling was unfamiliar. The air smelled of coffee and something else, that clean, lime scent that was uniquely Julian. Then it all came flooding back. The cooler, the confession, the kiss. The kisses. My heart gave a nervous lurch. I was in Julian's apartment. I was in his bed. I turned my head slowly. He was still asleep, lying on his stomach, his face turned towards me. One arm was flung over his head, the other resting near my side of the bed, his hand open and relaxed. His dark hair was a mess against the white pillowcase, and his face, in the soft morning light, looked younger, unguarded. His breathing was a deep, even rhythm in the quiet room. We hadn't done anything more than kiss. After that last, soft kiss in the bar, he had led me upstairs, his hand holding mine the entire way. His apartment was simple, clean, and masculine. Worn leather furniture, shelves overflowing with books, a few framed black and white photographs on the walls. It felt lived in and comfortable. He had given me a spare t-shirt to sleep in, pointed me to the bathroom, and when I came out, he was already in bed, the covers on my side turned down. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a quiet, shared intimacy that was more profound than anything I could have imagined. We had fallen asleep facing each other, the quiet murmur of our conversation about books and dreams and ridiculous customers eventually fading into a comfortable silence. But now, in the stark light of morning, anxiety began to creep in, a cold, familiar fog. What if last night was a mistake? A product of exhaustion and too much adrenaline? What if he woke up and regretted it? The fear of the morning after, the fear that the magic of the night would dissolve in the harsh light of day, was a paralyzing one. I felt an overwhelming urge to slip out of the bed, get dressed, and disappear before he woke up, preserving the memory of last night as a perfect, singular event, untarnished by morning after awkwardness. I held my breath, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, my fear warring with a desperate desire to stay. I watched the gentle rise and fall of his bare shoulders, the way a lock of hair fell across his forehead. He looked so peaceful, so real. The thought of leaving, of retreating back into my safe, lonely world, felt like a betrayal of the bravery I had finally found last night. As if sensing my internal turmoil, he stirred. His brow furrowed slightly, and he let out a low murmur in his sleep. Then, his eyes slowly blinked open. They were hazy with sleep for a moment, and then they focused on me. A slow, lazy smile spread across his face. It was the first thing I saw. No confusion, no regret, just a simple, warm smile of recognition. Morning, he rasped, his voice thick and low with sleep. Morning, I whispered back, my heart rate starting to slow from its frantic pace. He didn't move, just continued to look at me, his gaze soft and searching. You're still here, he stated, a note of quiet satisfaction in his voice. You told me to stay, I reminded him gently. Good, he said. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes never leaving mine. I woke up, and for a second, I thought I dreamed it. He reached out and gently touched my cheek, his thumb brushing over my skin, just as he had done last night. But you're real. The simple, heartfelt reassurance was a balm to my anxious soul. The fog of my fear began to dissipate under the warmth of his touch, his honest words. He wasn't regretting it. He was relieved. You're real, too, I said, and a real, genuine smile, one that wasn't tinged with anxiety, touched my own lips. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then his smile widened. Coffee, he asked. I make a terrible cup of coffee. It's my one domestic failing. I'm warning you now. I'll risk it, I said, laughing softly. The awkwardness I had dreaded never materialized. Making coffee in his kitchen was easy, comfortable. We moved around each other in the small space, our shoulders brushing, our hands touching as we reached for mugs. He was right. The coffee was terrible, but we drank it sitting at his small kitchen table, the gray morning lights streaming through the window, and it was the best cup of coffee I'd ever had. The test came a few days later. I walked into the bar on my usual Tuesday night, my stomach aflutter with a new kind of nervousness. It wasn't the nerves of unrequited love anymore. It was the nerves of a new, undefined relationship. How would we act? Would it be different? Would anyone notice? Julian was busy when I came in, but he saw me. His eyes lit up, and he gave me a quick, private smile before turning back to his customers. I slid onto my stool, and a wave of something akin to panic washed over me. We were back in our old positions, on opposite sides of the bar. What if the distance reasserted itself? But then, a few minutes later, he came over, placing a napkin in front of me. The usual, he asked, his voice professional, but his eyes were dancing with a private amusement. Please, I said, playing along. He made my drink, his movements as fluid and familiar as ever. But as he set it down in front of me, his fingers deliberately brushed against mine. A secret message passed in plain sight. I see you. I remember. The night progressed like that, a series of small, secret exchanges. A lingering look, a shared smile that no one else would understand. It was a thrilling, secret game. But then, the test arrived in the form of a loud, boisterous woman in a red dress who planted herself at the bar right next to me and proceeded to flirt shamelessly with Julian. Hey, handsome, she slurred, leaning over the bar. When do you get off? Maybe you and I could go make some bad decisions. A hot, ugly spike of jealousy shot through me. It was an emotion so intense it startled me. I had no claim on him. We hadn't defined anything. We had shared one night, a few kisses, and a terrible cup of coffee. Who was I to feel jealous? I watched, my jaw tight, as Julian gave her his easy, professional smile. Sorry, he said smoothly, wiping down the counter. I've already got plans. Oh, come on, she wheedled. Break him. I'm much more fun. Julian's gaze flickered to me for a fraction of a second. I kept my expression neutral, my eyes fixed on my drink, but my heart was pounding. This was it, a test of this fragile, new thing between us. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. I really can't, he said, his tone polite but firm. He then straightened up, and, in a move that made my breath catch, he reached over and gently squeezed my shoulder, right in front of her. My boyfriend here is the jealous type. He said the word, boyfriend, so casually, so easily, as if it were a fact he'd stated 1,000 times. The woman in the red dress looked from him to me, her eyes widening in surprise. I felt my face flush crimson. She mumbled an apology and quickly turned away. Julian left his hand on my shoulder for a moment, his thumb rubbing a slow, reassuring circle. Then he winked at me and moved down the bar to take another order, leaving me stunned, my heart hammering against my ribs, the word boyfriend echoing in my head. He had not only passed the test, he had rewritten the entire exam. He had claimed me, publicly and without hesitation. The jealousy I had felt moments before was replaced by a wave of possessive, overwhelming affection. He was mine, and I was his. The rest of the night passed in a daze. When the bar was empty and the doors were locked, he came around from behind the bar and pulled me off my stool. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around my waist, pulled me against his chest, and held me. I buried my face in his neck, breathing in his scent, my arms winding around him, holding on tight. Boyfriend, huh? I finally mumbled into his shirt. I felt his chest rumble with a low chuckle. Too soon? He asked, his voice teasing. No, I said, pulling back to look at him. Not soon enough. His smile was brilliant. He leaned down and kissed me, a deep, reassuring kiss that tasted of promise. The bar, my former fortress of solitude, no longer felt like a barrier between us. It felt like our place. It felt like the beginning. We decided to talk. Not that night, but the next. It felt important to give the conversation its own space, separate from the charged atmosphere of the bar or the sleepy intimacy of his bedroom. He suggested a walk, and so we found ourselves on a quiet Sunday afternoon, wandering through a park a few blocks from his place. The autumn air was crisp, and golden leaves crunched under our feet. It was a neutral, public space, yet it felt more private than anywhere we had been. I was nervous. Defining things meant they were real, and if they were real, they could break. The nebulous, thrilling space we had been occupying was safe in its own way. But I knew, and I think he knew, that we couldn't stay there forever. What he had said in the bar, claiming me as his boyfriend, had been a beautiful, impulsive gesture, but it needed to be backed by a conscious choice. A mutual one. We walked in a comfortable silence for a while, our hands occasionally brushing. It was Julian who finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. So, he began, his eyes on the path ahead. That word I used the other night. Boyfriend. My stomach did a nervous flip. Yeah. He stopped walking and turned to face me, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket. He looked uncharacteristically hesitant, the easy confidence he wore like a second skin momentarily absent. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, he said, his gaze earnest. It just came out. It felt right. He paused, searching my face. Did it feel right to you? The sincerity in his question, the vulnerability in his eyes, melted away my anxiety. He was giving me an out. He was making sure we were on the same page. This wasn't him telling me how it was going to be. This was him asking me what I wanted. It felt. I started, searching for the right word. Terrifying. And perfect. A slow smile spread across his face, a mixture of relief and affection. Terrifying and perfect, he repeated softly. I think I can live with that. We started walking again, but this time he reached for my hand, his fingers lacing firmly with mine. The publicness of the gesture, the simple act of holding hands in the light of day, felt like a declaration. It was a conscious choice. I'm not a casual person, Leo, he said after a moment, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. I don't do flings. I've been watching you for a long time. I was just waiting for you to be ready. Ready for what? I asked, my voice quiet. For this, he said simply, lifting our joined hands. To let someone in. I get the feeling you keep your walls pretty high. He wasn't wrong. My walls had been impenetrable fortresses for years, built from the bricks of past hurts and a deep-seated fear of intimacy. And yet, he had scaled them, not with force, but with patience. They're not so high anymore, I admitted. It was true. With him, I didn't feel the need for them. I felt safe. Good, he said. We walked a little further before he spoke again. So what do we do now? We figure it out together. It was a simple question, but it held the weight of a future. Figuring it out meant effort. It meant navigating the awkward parts, the disagreements, the fears. It meant building something real, something that existed outside the romantic bubble of the after-hours bar. Yeah, I said, my voice firm with a conviction that surprised me. I squeezed his hand. We figure it out together. That conversation was the foundation. The nights that followed were the quiet, steady work of building on it. I started spending more nights at his place. My toothbrush appeared in his bathroom, a silent but significant new resident. I learned the rhythms of his life outside the bar, his love for old movies, his terrible attempts at cooking, the way he hummed off-key when he was tidying up. And he learned mine, my need for quiet time with a book, my ridiculously specific coffee order, which he actually mastered, my tendency to overthink everything. Our intimacy grew not in grand gestures, but in small, domestic moments. The quiet intimacy of making breakfast together in our pajamas, moving in a comfortable, practiced dance in his small kitchen. The way he'd pull me back to bed for 10 more minutes of cuddling on a cold morning. Sitting on his rooftop, not with the charged tension of that first night, but wrapped in a blanket, his arm around me, watching the city lights come on. One night, we were closing the bar together. It had become our ritual. I'd sit at the bar, reading, while he did his final tasks. When he was done, he no longer had to ask me to stay. It was just assumed. He locked the front door and came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my chest and resting his chin on my shoulder, his body a warm, solid weight against my back. "What are you reading?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration against my ear. I showed him the cover. He kissed the side of my neck, a soft, lingering kiss. "Are you a million miles away?" he asked. I leaned my head back against his shoulder, closing my eyes. "No," I whispered. "I'm right here." And I wasn't escaping into the pages of a book anymore. My life, the one right here, was finally a story I wanted to be in. The quiet observer had stepped out from behind the cover and had found his place in the narrative. He turned my stool around to face him and leaned against the bar, pulling me between his legs. He didn't kiss me. He just held my gaze, his hands resting on my hips. The bar was silent around us, filled with the ghosts of our beginning. The air smelled of old wood and spilled beer and the faint, clean scent of him. It was the smell of home. My journey had started in this very spot, a lonely man watching a beautiful bartender, convinced he was a world away. I had been an island, content to watch the ships pass from a safe distance. But Julian hadn't just passed by. He had seen the light in the lighthouse, and he had steered his ship straight for the shore. He hadn't rescued me. He had simply joined me, showing me that I was never truly as isolated as I believed. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the kind, steady man who had seen my yearning and met it with his own, who had possessed the patience to wait and the courage to ask. The love I felt for him was a quiet, solid thing, a comfortable warmth that had settled deep in my bones. It wasn't a frantic, desperate crush anymore. It was a foundation. I reached up and cupped his face, my thumb tracing the line of his jaw. My hand didn't tremble this time. It was steady, confident. "Another," I said softly, echoing his words from that first, fateful night. "Or us." A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. The crooked one. He leaned in, his forehead pressing against mine. "Always us, Leo," he whispered. "From now on, it's always us." And in the quiet of the bar, in the comforting circle of his arms, I felt the final brick of my fortress crumble away, not into rubble, but into dust, leaving nothing but an open, hopeful space for a new life to be built. I was no longer alone in my corner. I was home,